So this week we're going to look at the mitzvah, the chiyuv of davening with a mechitza. This actually came up. The subject came up when I was chatting with somebody, and he was saying that maybe if we don't get a minyan, we were davening in the same place. And if we don't have a minyan, there's across the street. There was an egalitarian minyan taking place, and so he said, well, maybe b'diavad we would daven there. And I looked at him and I said, no, there's no b'diavad. This is not a lechatchila b'diavad issue. This is more clear cut than that. This is simply usher, not to daven with a mechitza. But then I wanted to look into this further and really try to understand what is the inyan of mechitza, where does it come from, what is the actual chiyuv. So with that in mind, we will take a look at a tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein that was about 78 years ago, so somewhere around 1940, 1941. The question was posed to Rav Moshe. He says, "B'hash d'she'ona levair inyan hamechitza shetzurich lihiyos bein anoshim lanoshim bebeis hakneses v'kama hu shir gova aliba dehilchasa mishum sheyesh mekamos b'medinasenu." So he says, what is the what's the chiyuv, what's the size requirements of a mechitza to daven that separates men and women? Because in this Medina, again, talking 80 years ago, a lot of the Orthodox shuls were beginning to take down the mechitza and make them into more traditional, or what they called at the time, conservative synagogues. So he says, "Shenisha lanu lemikdash ma'at." Right, this is our shuls are what remains for us, a mikdash ma'at. V'after she'en chashudim sheyavru adina ela michasron yidiyas chomer ha'eser. This is possible that people are walking away from shuls that have a mechitza because they simply don't realize. Like this person I was chatting with, they just didn't realize the just how chomer the iser really is of davening without a mechitza. L'chein rotze. And it's interesting, the person who asks the question, he says, is Marino Harav Rabbeinu Rav David Stern Minahel Yeshivas Travadas. I'm not familiar with this person, but it's interesting that this is a someone who was at the time in the leadership, the administration of Yeshiva Torah Vadas. So clearly it was something that he was seeing. And he wanted to sort of get the word out of like, hey, let's talk about just how stringent this requirement is that we daven with a mechitza, because people simply don't realize what's going on. So Rav Moshe says, "V'hine etzem adin she'af im ha'anashim heim b'tzad echad v'anashim b'tzad acher surim hein lihiyos b'lo mechitza hu lefi aniyas daiti dina deraisa." He says, you might ask me, well, what happens if, we simply have men on one side, women on the other, and there's no mechitza, but they're separated. So Rav Moshe says, no, it's still a problem. And what kind of problem are we talking about? Mechitza is a din deraisa, according to Rav Moshe. And what we're going to see is he's going to bring the raya from this, to this from the Gemara and Sukkah. But just to, I guess as a brief intro, he's going to spend a lot of time in this tshuva maintaining and developing this idea that it is deraisa. And if you look at it and try to say it's derabanan, he is going to take any of those sources that might indicate that it's not deraisa, and he's going to refute them, meaning that he's spending a lot of time developing and concretizing this psak that it is a din deraisa, and there's nothing else, there's no other discussion to have around it. It's very interesting how in other tshuvas, Rabbi Moshe doesn't necessarily do that. He might just go through sources and give you his psak. Here, he's going through other opinions as well and saying, no, this isn't this isn't the way we paskin. This is not how I see it, as Rabbi Moshe, and therefore really sort of drilling into us that this is a din deraisa and you can't forego it. So he says, "V'rayel mesukah daf nun aleph shehiksha begemara al guzastra she'asu be'ezras nashim b'motzei yom tov harishon shel chag kedei lahoshiv hanashim el mala v'hanashim el mata." So, quick background here, and we'll take a look at the Gemara inside. And what's going on is the Gemara says the Gemara is talking about the Motzei Yantif, the first day of Sukkot, and they were getting ready for the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And I guess the way it works just logistically is that they would go into the Shiloach, into the Sawad, to draw water and bring it back up to the Beis HaMikdash. So you have the Kohanim and the Levim who are in the Beis HaMikdash and then who need to descend out of the Beis HaMikdash and into the Shiloach. So they're going to do that by way of the Ezras Nashim. So they have to walk through the Ezras Nashim, and that's where this problem comes up. And then what we'll see is how they solved the issue of men and women who are intermingling in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Mishnah, this is the famous Mishnah Lo Ra Simchas Beis HaShoeva Lo Ra Simcha Meimav. If you've never seen the Simcha of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, you've never really seen Simcha. And it says, "B'Mosei Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag Yardu LeEzras Nashim U'Mesaktin Sham Tikun Gadol." So the first night, Motzei Shabbos, first night after the first day of Yantif, they would go into the Ezras Nashim, and they did this. They were metakin. The Mishnah says they're metakin a great tikkun. So we'll have to see what that means, and that's when we're going to get into what this really is. So let's look at the Gemara. The Gemara asks, "My tikkun gadol." What was this great tikkun that they did? So I'm a Rabbi Elazar. Bowser Shaninu Chalaka Haisa me Rishona Vigifu Gazustra Viskinu Shehe Nashim Yoshvos Melmala Vanashim Melmata. He said they made this. What did they do? They basically re-architected the Ezras Nashim, and they built a balcony where the women were up above and the men were down below. Rabbanan Bereshona Hayu Nashim Mifnim Vanashim Bechutz. And we have a source that says that at the beginning, before they made this change, the Nashim were within the Ezras Nashim. Obviously, the men were outside again because they have to go through the Ezras Nashim to get to the Shiloach. And the problem was they would descend into the Ezras Nashim. You had a problem of levity, that you'd have this intermingling of men and women. So what do they do? Iskinu shehu Nashim Yoshvos Mebechutz Nashim Mebefnim. So I said, okay, let's take the women out of the Ezras Nashim. We'll let the men go through the Ezras Nashim. But Dayin Hayu Boin Lidei Kalas Rosh. But they're still intermingling as the men would have to, the Kohanim and Levim would have to go, past the women to go into the Ezras Nashim. So then Yiskinu Shehu Nashim Yoshvos Melamala Nashim Melamata. Then they built this balcony, and the men and the women would be above and the men below. So heichi avid hachi, but then the Gemara says, okay, great, you've solved this problem of kalas rosh. But the Gemara says, how can you do this? V'haksiv hakol bechsav miyad Hashem hasachel. So the pasuk in Divrei Yamim, when it's talking about the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and talking about how David talked to Shlomo about it, and it says everything was exeris hakasav, everything was in the ksav. It was all handed over through Nevuah. We understood how to build it, and that's it. So how do you now go back and make alterations to the architecture of the Beis HaMikdash that wasn't originally part of the plans that came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So Amar Rav. So Rav says, how do I answer that? It says, Kra Ashkachu v'darush. I have a Kra, and we can darush in the Kra, and that's my source that says that we can make alterations if we need to at the Beis HaMikdash. What's the source? V'safta ha'aretz mishpachos levad, mishpachos beis David levad, and neshehem levad. So the pasuk in Zechariah is talking about it's a nevuah to the future, that there's going to be a great hesped, and what's going to happen is that the families are going to have to separate out, where the women are separate from the men in the times of a hesped. So Amru v'halo devarim kal v'chomer. And they said this is a kal v'chomer from this pasuk. This is the lima. This is the drash. V'mala asi lavosha oskuim behesped ve'ein yetzer hara sholet bahem. So this is a great hesped. There's no yetzer hara. There's no typical levity, intermingling, and that sort of thing that we have to worry about. Amra Torah anashim levad v'anashim levad. And yet still we see that there's a separation between men and women. Here we're talking about the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And then we have to worry about the Yitzhahara in this case. So al achas kama v'chama. Okay, so so therefore we have this drush that we can see that there are times when you have to separate men and women, and this is one of those times, and so therefore we can see that this is actually part of the original design or the original specifications of the Beis Hamikdash would have to have included this as part of the Ezras Nashim. It simply wasn't done until this point in time. We won't get into why, but that's how Rav understands the sugya that understands the Mishnah. We'll see. Rav Moshe is going to quote this as well, so let's just take a look at it now. The Yerushalmi has a very similar Gemara. This is the Tikun Gadol, Matikun Hayu Osin Sham, Shahayu Ma'amidim Ha'anashim Bifnei Atzman V'Ha'anashim Bifnei Atzman. Right, we separate the men and the women. Kihi de Taninan Taman V'Chalka Hayisa Berosha V'Hikifua Gazustra Sha'anashim Rose Melamala V'Anashim Melamata. Again, very similar. The women were above, the men were below, and women were in the balcony. Kadesh Lo Yehem Uravin, so they're not mixed together, intermingling. Mi Lamdu Midvar Torah. So how do we know this? We learn it from Midvar Torah, Vesafta Haaretz, Mishbachos, Lavad, etc. So it says, right. So that is, so we have Yerushalmi that's basically saying the same thing, and we'll see in just a moment that Rav Moshe is going to quote that as well. Okay, so back up to okay. Okay, so Rav Moshe quotes that Mishnah of the Gemara. He says, "Shehiksha beGemara al guzastra shasu be'ezros nashim mosei yenta ferishin shachat kedei lahushivat nashim melamala v'nashim melamata v'aksiv hakol b'chsav." Right. So, but the Gemara asks, "How do you do this?" Because there's everything came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We designed the Beis Hamikdash. We can't just make alterations to it. Sha'asur lahosif shum davar bebinyan habayis u'ba'azara. We can't make any additions. The tears Rav Dekra Ashkechusha Tzurich Lahavdil Anashim and Nashim. It appears Rashi Ayin Sham, and that's we didn't see the Rashi inside, but he's explained the way we did. Upashot Kavanas Hateruts who Shalachenu Kamafurish Tzurich Laasos Azizin Vaguzastra Velo Hutzrich Lema Ze Ayide God Hachoze V'Nasan Anavi Shodio Lahem Api Hashem Elechazatavnis Vahave Gzir. Okay, so meaning that this is all sort of we don't need to this is all would have been part of the actual design. This is simply an alteration that works within the design of how the Beis Hamikdash was meant to be built in the first place. Now, so now Reb Moshe is going to say, okay, so from here it would seem very clearly that it's a deraisa, because the incorporation of this balcony into the Beis Hamikdash, we're saying, fits in with the initial chiyuv to build the Beis Hamikdash and within the actual design of it as well. So he says, "V'im hayazer rak iser drabana lo hayashayach l'meimar shehu memela bechlal kol bechsav." Right, Rav Stera says it works within this. His drush from Zechariah works within the. Works within the actual ksav of the requirement to build the Beis Hamikdash, and there's nothing additional that's needed. But if it were simply derabanan, it wouldn't have said that. Shein tzarech zeh midaraisa because vade lo shayach sheyidche as a iser takol b'chsav af im haya iser midaraisa koshakin iser shehu midarabanan lo yidche iser hakol b'chsav shehu midaraisa. He says the other problem is that if you're going to tell me it's only derabanan, then how does this work at all? We can't change that the Gemara's kasha was you can't change how there's the initial design, which all came from the Nevi'im, it came from Nevuah. You can't change that. So if it's only D'Rabbanan, who says that the rabbis could have made that change? They couldn't. That's the Gemara's kasha. And he says, "Mefurish b'chulin demitzad iser hakol b'chsav yadinin delo ba'inin akisu yadam b'mukdashim." He brings another riot to this from chulin and kisu yadam, and we won't get into these other riots that he brings. But again, we can see that Rav Moshe is pulling from all sources, really all of his bekiyas, to show us that don't try and pull other sources. Don't try to show me that no, there's other cases where it's where we can clearly see it's derabanan. It's not. And he brings from all these sources to show that those are also derisive. So, okay. So, and to that point, he says, who Yerushalmi Sukkah, right? He again, just emphasizing what he's been saying. He brings down the Gemara Yerushalmi that we saw. Sha'amru al zeh sha'asu hatikun b'hosafa al habinyan lamdu midvar Torah ein sham. It says clearly midvar Torah, which is what we saw as well. It says midvar Torah. So Amashahu Nikra Dvar Torah. It sounds like again, it's all from the Torah, it's all derisa. V'yavshe'enu ela krab divrei Kabbalah. Now you're going to tell me, oh, okay, but the pasuk in Zechariah, that is midivrei Kabbalah. It doesn't have the same power as if it came from the Chumash of Moshe Rabbeinu. She says Yesh Lamelef Shapir Shahari Lo Ba Hakra Lachadesh Yisurin Shneim Malon Yafin Misham Ella Shneimar Bikrad Divrei Kabbalah Yaspidu Kedina Torah Anashim Levad Benashim Levad. He says it's not coming to be mechadesh anything. We can't be mechadesh anything from Nevim and Ksuvim. But what we can learn is halachos within something that we've already established. And this is something a halachah within something we've already established is that we separate men from women. Who kamoshalim shalamadanu kamadim maasehem shal hanavim hashoftim b'amlachim shehus grubekrod the divrei Kabbalah. He says just like we learn other halachos just from the maisim of those of the Nevi'im, of the Shoftim, of the Malachim, the kings. Like all of those, we can learn how they interacted or what they did, what their actions were, and from that we can learn halachos. Even though we're not learning an entire new mitzvah, so too over here, all we can learn from Zechariah is that there was this idea of separation of men and women, and that we can apply that halacha to the binyan beis hamikdash. This is va'ayin b'tosas zvachim shemafurish b'divrei. Again, he's just bringing in more sources now to really bolster his position. Shemifresh b'divrei should be shvil iser d'rabbanan haya iser lahosif shekas v'leavet pishpesh. Kedei lakayim smicha b'asher mitzora shesover shehu midaraisa. Let's start levata din take of this the smicha shchita. So here's the thing over there. So in this Gemara in Zvachim, it's talking about a mitzora. So a mitzora, when he brings the his asham, he has to do smicha, and he has to do smicha on the animal, and then it's shechted. There's this, there's a din deraisa that you have to have smicha right. You have to have smicha and then shchita right after the smicha. So the problem is that this mitzora was not yet, because he hadn't been sprinkled yet, which comes from his asham. Therefore, he couldn't go into the Beis Hamikdash proper. So therefore, the question is, how do we do smicha and shchita? Because you can only do shchita in a specific area where he wasn't supposed to be going into. So it's a whole question, like how is this going to work? So shesover shehu midaraisa. It's deraisa that the yistarchu levato didn't take of the smicha shchita mitzad gezerah shemayir bipsios. So on the one hand, what he's saying is that on the one hand we have a din deraisa that you have to do smicha v'shchita. And so, but on the other hand, you have a din derabanan that the rabbis didn't want him, walking around too much in the Beis Hamikdash, because then he'll be over on a lav if he's walking around there too much. So it seems like it probably would have been possible for him to just go into a smicha and leave, but the rabbanan were worried that he would end up being over on a lav of being tamei and being inside the Beis Hamikdash where he's not allowed to be. So that's their gzeira of shema yarbe bepsius. He's gonna walk around too much in there. So if sharmishum the yarbe bepsius gzeira drabanan ba'almahiv karei khan. Oh, sorry. There's also so the Gemara answers, well, why don't you lavid pishpesh? Why don't you just sort of make this alteration into the wall that sort of separated the part of the Beis Hamikdash she's not allowed to go into? Just make a little cut into it, and he can put his hands over and do his smicha and be done. So Tosha says Yefshar mishum de yarbe b'sis gezer drabanan be'alma ki v'kri kana ko bechsav ayin sham. And so you can't, just because there's a din derabbanan that we're worried about of him walking around too far, you can't change the Beis Hamikdash for that rule. That's what Tosfos is saying. So it says v'im kin gam hocha, and they bring the same reason of hakol b'chsav, the same thing, the same everything has to be done by the word of the Nevi'im, by the word of Kodesh Baruch Hu, of how we build the Beis Hamikdash, and we can't make changes for that on a din derabbanan. So it says, "V'im kin kam hacha im haya zer rak midrabanan lo haya efshar lahosif levada shutzer chulazus a gezustra midaraisa shemilahu bechla hakol bechsav kilel." So clearly, we can see from that kasha by Tosfos that the same thing would apply here, is that we would have problems if the change that they made of these balconies was only a din drabanan. We'd have the same problem that they had over in Gemara and Zvachim. So again, just bolstering his point that this is a din deraisa. Now then he goes into a proof. He goes into a long piece by the Maharsha that Maharsha has a different way of looking at it. That the Rav Moshe spends a lot of time just refuting the Maharsha, all this long piece that we just sort of scroll through. We're not going to see it inside, but again, just spending a lot of time bolstering his position. So then he says, "Melech Chazidin the sugya the sukkah the afim hoisa mechitza." And here's something else that we learned from that Gemara Sukkah, that even if there was a mechitza, which there was in the first place, right? There was Ezra's Nashim, and there was the Azara of all Kazusha after Levoli de Kalas Rosh, but the problem was that it didn't suit the purpose. Sure, Yesh ha'eser midaraisa to ha'af berishona shahayu nashim mifnim v'anashim mebechutz perish Rashi anashim hayu be'ezras nashim anashim hayu berachov shal har habayis v'chel shahayis mechitza gedola v'neihem b'din mechitza aval kevan shehusur chulam od neged ha'sha'arim ha'psuchim kedei liros es ha'simcha rosh buli de kalas rosh. But one, during the simchas bisur shoeva, the women are going to try and sort of press up against the gates that were open to be able to see what's going on, and now you have intermingling and you have kalas rosh going on. V'lo ho'ilu ha'mechitza, and therefore the mechitza is no longer functioning the way it was supposed to be. Yimkein haya adayin isur medaraisa. So now this isur medaraisa comes back because the way that it was built in the first place is no longer functioning. It's not serving the purpose anymore. So shalachein huter lasos is agazusra, and that's the heter to make the balcony. Shemizer raya shehu midaraisa could be arti. Again, it's all going back to what he's saying. That's all deraisa. Vein lomer she'eser haya midin yichud shehu midaraisa. And he says, now you're going to tell me maybe the whole thing is a problem of yichud, which is also deraisa. He rejects that whole notion as well. That's not the problem. So it says hayotzim mizeh. So he says, if you're going to ask me, how should we architect our shuls today? We should also make a balcony. Women on the top, men on the bottom. Interestingly enough, that's probably why, and this is Rav Moshe is probably also building this on how shuls used to be built, right? That was actually very common up until probably 100 years ago or something like that. Certainly, in that time frame, it certainly was very common to have a balcony for the women. So he says we should model our shuls after the Beis Hamikdash that same way. And if that's impossible to do, then you have to build a mechitza. Now, kazusha timna milavo lidei kalas rosh, and what's the purpose of it? It's to avoid the issue of levity. V'lo sagi b'masha nechshava mechitza l'chol davar kagon b'sha'arem psuchim k'moshe re'inu shelo ho'ilu b'mikdash v'haya aser midaraisa. And it says you can't just, don't think that you can just put up some minimal thing that sort of a demarcation of women over there, men over here. That's not going to work because, as we saw, it didn't help in the Beis Hamikdash when you had something that didn't function. So if it's not actually going to function in terms of preventing the intermingling and therefore the kalas rosh, then it's not considered to be a true mechitza. So if it's too low, it's not going to work. He says 10 tefachim is not enough. Maybe 40 inches high, it's not enough. she'ena klum le'idin kalas rosh, because how is that going to actually stop anybody from intermingling? You can talk across it. You can talk to somebody. You can have a whole conversation, right? Believe shum kushi without any difficulty. Malega biyadeihem. You can even hold hands across it. I mean, what does it do? Right? So there's no. That is the definition of levity. כמעורבים ממש ועשה מדרייסה שגרוע היא ממחיצה שהבדילה בין עזרס נשים לחבמתה שלא הועילו אף שהייסה יוסר ניכר. אלא צריכים לעשות מחיצה גבוה במידה כזו שלא יבוא לידי קלס ראש. So he says that you have to have, if you can't have the balconies, you at least have to have a mechitza that's tall enough to prevent the intermingling between the men and women. Says of mistaber linin lefiani is daiti sheksagi b'mechitza gavo ad achar ksafim. Says it, but it should be enough as long as the the mechitza is at least shoulder high. The hari chazinish mechitza ina mitzad isrei staklus. He says it's not a problem of seeing that there are women there. Kesavti le'er shazeh hari yadu gam. Like that wasn't a problem originally in the base of Matrix. They had a mechitza that as for the men, but it wasn't like they were building it in a way in the beginning that they couldn't see each other. It was only later that they put them on the balcony to prevent the intermingling. So histaklus, he says, is not a problem. Mikrashim and Rachim al Aziz and Abotim Mistam Gazusra ina Mechitza ayin eruvim. He says, and he wants to say that a Gazusra is not necessarily like a whole, like it doesn't, that you can't see through the balcony and see to the other side. He says that that's not implicit in the language there, and it's very likely that they could see each other. That wasn't the problem. So he says, Va'afsha Rambam and Perush Mishnah Sukkah Sham Kasav Kadesha Lo Yistaklo Nashim Benashim Ayin Sham. The Rambam says it is a problem of histaklus. Ein leforish mitzad isri staklus kulel magam shahari af kishehin lamala ein neros bekeven shelo huska shahaiza mechitza lezuz kulel dochelim asher bekeven shelo nero ela lamdum beemtza b'nei shasham hayu rak merakdim besimchas beisoshoy v'shem hayu rak chasidim yashim ma'aseh shelahem ein kpeda beistaklus klerav gido brachos shari lo. Okay, so the Rav Moshe is trying to understand, like, how does the Rambam understanding this of histaklus doesn't seem to be mistaver from the Gemara itself. So it says Milashon Rambam and Perusho Mashma Shemakam Sha'anashim Lo Haya Lamata Tachas Agazustra Kasav Shahayu Metakenim Makom La'anashim Makom La'anashim Makom La'anashim Lamala Makom La'anashim Lo Kasav Milashon of Ravadia Shahayu Moshivim Anashim Lamala Anashim Lamata Shahaya Mashma Tachas Agazustra Lamasha Shalo Hayu Anashim Lamata Min Anashim Ella Makom Anashim Hayu Lamata Al Haritzpa Makom Anashim Hayu Lamala Makom Gavo Vachin Mashma Gam Lashon Milashono Berches Halacha Beis. And he says that it seems like from the Lashon of the Rambam, it's not like the women had to be completely on top of the men. That wasn't the case, that the men have to be underneath them. It could be that it's just that the women are higher up than the men, but not necessarily that they were above them, right above their heads. So we're running out of time. Maybe we'll carry this on for one more week to see the rest, because there are other inyanim that Rav Moshe brings into, but this is sort of the key discussion around what is the chiyuv, what's the purpose for the mechitza in the first place. And he says very clearly it's not for histaklus, although we're going to see that there could be other issues. For instance, if there's a problem of the way that the women are dressing that maybe not tznua, and then there could be a problem of histaklus as well. But that's a separate inyan altogether from the ikar din, or the ikar requirement for having a mechitza in the first place. So we'll stop here.